A breakthrough weight loss jab which helps obese patients lose 15% of their body weight is being made available on the NHS for the first time. It's hailed as a game changer by the Prime Minister. There are hopes it will reduce hospital pressures and save lives.
Well, current guidelines recommend the jab should only be used for a maximum of 2 years. But in order to tackle the country's growing obesity crisis, should these drugs actually be prescribed for life? Well, joining us from Bletchley is Alex Guevara, a paramedic who's used weight loss drugs before, and in Halifax is Paul Gately, Professor of Exercise and Obesity at Leeds Beckett University. Good morning to both of you. Alex, let's come to you first. What's your experience of this and the difference that it makes?
Yeah, thank you. I've used this drug for a number of years now, obviously privately, because it's not been available on the NHS before. And I've seen really good weight loss results and an overall improvement in many health conditions. And I work in primary care, so I see people every day who are struggling with their weight. So for me, it's been hugely beneficial, almost really life-changing, I would say.
And we can see there the pictures of you. It's helped you to lose a lot of weight, hasn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's not just the weight, it's the lifestyle improvements that come with that and the reduction in health conditions. You know, I had really bad asthma, which I don't have anymore, the ability to lead a fuller life. I know some people say, or you'll find people say it's not a miracle, but for some people like myself, actually, it pretty much has been something pretty close. OK,
so you would be calling for it to be used on a longer-term basis. At the moment, it's got the guidance that it should only be used for a maximum of 2 years from the National Institute for Care and Excellence. But in your mind, it should be available longer-term for those people who want to use it for longer.
Well, I think what we've got to do is look at the clinical evidence. And as a clinician, you know, I've studied the evidence in detail, and what that shows is that where it's in use around the world already, that people who take the drug and lose weight successfully then start putting weight back on when the drug is stopped. So the limitation there, I think, is that NICE have put in is around the uncertainty over what the future looks like for people using it long term. And that's why they've capped it based on saying, well, we don't know what the overall cost is going to be or whether it's going to be effective long term. But the clinical evidence shows that once you stop taking the drug, the majority of people will regain the weight back. So we've got to factor that clinical evidence into our long-term patient treatments.
Professor Gately, you're a professor in exercise and obesity at Leeds Beckett University. Just to understand what this being prescribed on the NHS is going to mean. At the moment, the NHS is talking about it being available for 2 years only, and that would be partly because the evidence says 2 years is safe. We don't know about taking it for longer. And also, I guess with the NHS, it will be about making sure that we can keep a lid on costs. But in the case of a statin for people's heart health, people take statins for years and years and years. Do you think if the evidence and the cost pressures allow, the guidance will change over time and we'll end up prescribing Ozempic or these other semaglutide drugs for much longer periods of time, for 10, 20 years?
Well, I think there's two really important questions here, and Alex has really given us an overview for himself. And as Alex will appreciate, any good scientist looks beyond the sample of one person, and we know that these drugs work for a number of people, but we also know that they're not effective for everybody and they're not acceptable for everybody. And so what we've got to do is make sure that we consider the needs of our population. And there are about, you know, we're into the 20-odd million people in the UK with an unhealthy weight. So we've got a real major issue that we've got to look at. And you're absolutely right that when we consider the use of these drugs, both for the scale of the population and for the duration of people's life course, we've also got to be mindful of what the cost of that will be for the impact it will have on people's life and their health, and therefore the cost pressures on our NHS. And at the moment, there's a number of uncertainties around that. What we know is our healthcare budget is massively under pressure. We've got a variety of areas across the country where health pressures are so significant that, you know, we're not clear whether Wegovy is going to be prescribed in local areas because of the cost pressures in local areas to local NHS budget. So there's one really important factor that even though the guidance is for 2 years, there are certain areas where it's likely to be rationed versus made available for a large majority of people. Then we get to the second question around the long-term use of this drug. And, you know, Alex is right, and Alex has shown some really good outcomes during his use of it. But what we've also got to consider is people are people, and some people stick to the guidelines and use the drugs as required, but there are others that life just takes over, and so they sort of don't use the drug as it's prescribed, and sometimes they're on it, sometimes they're off it, and as Alex has shown, when people come off it, the weight gain is coming back. And then finally, what we've also got to consider is that just because people lose weight, it might not necessarily massively improve their health if they're not more physically active, if they don't eat a healthy diet, if they're not sleeping well, then those things, independent of people's weight, have an impact on their health. So we've got to manage all those things together. It's a really useful drug for people, but it's not useful for everybody.
But also, doesn't that point to the fact then that it's sort of a useful sticking plaster for 2 years? You know, you both made the point that actually when people come off it, then they tend to put the weight back on. So what is the answer then, Professor Gately, from that point of view? Because if the support there isn't to say to people, right, this is what you need to do alongside, or if people aren't prepared to do that, then at the moment, OK, it helps them for 2 years, but with the current situation, then it just goes back to how things were beforehand.
Yeah, and I really think that's an important point. And Alex made a really important point about, you know, Alex's use of this has been private. And what we know is there's a real sort of variability between there's some really conscientious private providers and some not so conscientious private providers. So it's a bit of a, you know, it's a bit of a challenge to know what are people getting, whereas under the NHS there are clear guidelines. And we work with the NHS, we deliver services across the country, and we're using Wegovy, we're using Saxenda, and that'll be part of our NHS treatment plans. But we also have doctors and dietitians and psychologists, because a well-rounded intervention pathway is absolutely critical here. And if we don't have a well-rounded pathway for people, and that's what we do at More Life, we work with our doctors, we work with our psychologists, because one of the things we've observed is we know about 30% of people living with a weight problem or living with obesity also suffer with disordered eating, and therefore what we have to do is make sure that we manage that disordered eating alongside their use of Wegovy or Saxenda. And that's really critical that we get that balance right. And if people don't have that support because maybe they're accessing the drug privately and all they're doing is just getting the drug but not the mental health support, then that could be really problematic for them. And so, you know, through the NHS, we can be much more assured that it's effective and long-term and safe use of these drugs, whereas private may have a variety of different of issues that may not support the health of that individual over the long term. And that's really critical to consider.
I understand that, Professor Gately. But, of course, in the end, if you want to be healthy, there's lots of things you have to do, but taking the drug might be part of that. Alex, in your case, are you 100% relying on the drug to keep your weight down, or have you also changed your lifestyle, your eating, your exercise? And if it was working for you, would you like to take this drug on the NHS for 10 years?
Yeah, of course, there's things that I've done to improve my lifestyle, but I think we need to think about moving away from this mantra of complete and utter 100% personal responsibility, which is the diet and exercise factor that you know, if you just get off the sofa and move a little bit more, you're going to lose weight. If you stop eating so much, you're going to lose weight, because what we know now is that appetite is controlled by the brain and a host of other factors such as environment and genetics. So for me, the medication, and for a lot of other people, the medication is providing support for my body that allows me to do those things, those additional things that I need to keep the weight off. And without medication, that control of appetite is lost, and it becomes so much harder to do all those other things. So it's no different really to any other medication that we use for controlling blood pressure or high cholesterol. I personally would be very happy to take medication for the rest of my life. There's quite a lot of research out there about semaglutide now. It's been in use for a long, long time for patients with diabetes, and it has an excellent safety profile. So I would rather take that drug for the rest of my life and keep my weight down and have all those benefits that being at a lower weight gets me, than take it for an arbitrary period and then feel like I'm then left on my own to manage that.
Okay.
Alex, Professor Gately, thank you very much indeed. Interestingly, Novo Nordisk, the Denmark company, 100-year-old company, which makes this drug and has the patent for it, is currently the most valuable company in the whole of Europe, worth £340 billion, because everybody around the world wants to buy this drug from them. But of course, you know, in the end, the price will come down when other people are allowed, when the patent ends. But
it's quite something, isn't it?
they're doing quite well out of it.
But I think everybody's, you know, hoping it's going to be the magic bullet, aren't they, to cure the problem. But, yeah, thank you very much.